Now, in terms of you said bodybuilding rep ranges, I think if we can kind of break that down even as dumb as possible for people, you know, it's like, what threshold do you need to cross over in the gym to make sure you're doing the right thing?
Yeah, and that's something I don't know that anyone knows. I don't know. I mean, I know there's, you know what happens, like how mTOR is involved in the process that stimulates, you know, muscle protein synthesis, you know, what, like, you know, leucine is the amino acid trigger for that. You know, so it's somewhere more, one rep's not doing it, or very much, you know, and 50 reps isn't doing it. It's probably it's probably stimulating the highest level of muscle protein synthesis in like the 8 to 12 rep range, probably. But time under tension's involved in that. Are you pausing between each rep? From my not really science backed, although there is some evidence in EMG analysis of this type of training, I think the best training is essentially what Ronnie Coleman did, which if you watch the way he trained, it was bad form. We talked about this yesterday too. Bad form because he never locked out and he lifted explosively. But it appears, and there's some data to correlate with this, it appears that explosive concentric motion, not a lot of worry about the eccentric other than avoiding injury, and then constant tension on the muscle, which is how he trained. You watch him do like shoulder press, it's this. Explosives up, not all the way lock out, and then somewhere in that, whether it's the reps or time under tension, that range, but for most people it's probably in that 8 to 12 rep range primarily, although you're gonna wanna spread it out overall. You know, you're gonna wanna go down to 5 to 6 reps sometimes, certainly on certain movements like a deadlift, you're gonna wanna go down, but probably somewhere in that range.
It's really going to depend on the body part too. Like I think different body parts very much respond differently to different types of training, different stimuli, different rep ranges just based on how what actually makes up the muscle. So like we've talked about this before too, something like delts or your arms. They're not used, you know, for 1 or 2 heavy hard contractions. We use them all the time. And so there are certain muscle groups that I find tend to respond well to more of that kind of high rep range. And you'll see people take like rear delts into the 20, 30, 40, even 50 rep range. And I think that at the end of the day, it's not that it doesn't matter, but are you doing something hard? Are you doing something that's hard on the muscle?
Let's circle back to Ronnie just for all the people that are going to be making comments saying that's all bullshit, right? Because Stan and I talked about Ronnie just a little bit. I may be wrong on what I'm going to say here, but I don't think I am. How healthy are his shoulders? I don't think he's ever had a shoulder surgery.
No.
What about his elbows?
Same.
Never had an elbow surgery. What about his knees?
Same.
Never had knee surgery, right? So we're talking about low back is the biggest culprit, which probably played a lot into his hips.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
now, the
sure.
low back,
Absolutely.
if you look at the history, it was kind of a botched surgery to begin with. Now, when people are like, oh, his training's all fucked up, they're usually talking about the dumbbell presses, the bench presses, the incline presses. So I'm going to circle back and say, how many pec tears? How many tricep tears? What's his shoulders look like? What's his elbows look like? Because how come you're going to use him as the example of that training's all fucked up, but you're only talking about his back?
Yeah, and which all started from a heavy squat where he felt a pop and then like didn't treat it properly.
You see what I'm saying though? It's because it's like, oh, look at him, look at him, look at him. Or they'll say, well, look at Branch. And okay, let's look at Branch. Let's look at Johnny Jackson.
Well, Jay Cutler is an even better example because he lifted explosively, partial reps, you know, and trained a totally different style, much higher volume, but he still did that core of what I believe is the best, which is not locking out, explosive concentric motion, not a lot of care or of the eccentric other than, you know, avoiding injury. And he's like the textbook example of how you can work your way through extreme bodybuilding and come out healthy on the other side.
But it totally makes sense if you think about it. I mean, in order to have that kind of force production for explosiveness, there has to be coordination on a small scale level, right? So you think about something like a shoulder joint where there are a whole bunch of small muscles that have to work together to coordinate to stabilize the ball in the socket. If you're going to be able to produce force quickly and explosively, there has to be a prerequisite level of coordination across the joint, not just that joint, but probably below it for the stabilizing structures. So of course it makes sense that, yeah, if he's not locking out all the way when he's relying on, you know, joints to hold the weight, but he's actually putting that tension through the muscle to support the joints, absolutely makes sense.
And I think the form thing, I think is the worst debate because it's the wrong things are being argued. Because if you go on the internet, and good form on the internet is 2 seconds up, lock out, 4 seconds down. And you're not gonna get hurt doing that form. You're not, but it's good form meaning like pretty much you're not going to get hurt because you can't use any weight, you know.
Yeah, you're not going to really get stronger either.
So is good form just mean like very low risk of injury, or is good form what's creating hypertrophy? And because if you go on the internet, all the really huge dudes, if you go to the comments, are apparently using terrible form.
Yeah.
And all the people using good form are all really, really small dudes or chicks. So I think I think it's the wrong argument. Like, what is good? Are we doing it for hypertrophy because that's what good form is to me? Or and you have to also, if I'm doing it for powerlifting, good form is I move the weight from A to B within the rules of that federation or that lift. Yeah.
And that, what you had mentioned, Dani, about the coordination, right? Like, I think something that's important too is in terms of technique is there is a prerequisite of skill that they need, like within the movement, right? The technique and whatnot. But we had a conversation based on like, your body is fucking way smarter than, everybody's body is way smarter than we are, right? It's like, you can try to outthink your body, but if you put your body in a position, it, for the most part, for most people, will do the thing it needs to do to stabilize that position.
Well, Justin's a great example. I mean, he was doing a row movement, and the first thing that came on for him was his anterior delt. Now, if you look at a textbook, of course, everybody like, oh, well, that shouldn't happen. He's rowing. It should be his upper back. But the fact of the matter is, he has a long history of being a very strong presser. He sits at a computer most of the day. He has a neurogenic amount of tension where, like, this is his body's reference center. And your brain is always going to look to keep you safe, and it's always going to look to produce force from a neurologic reference center from which it feels stable and good to go. So if you're constantly referencing on a kind of, again, neurological level here, your brain will consistently choose that.
And it's like the idea that those motion capture suits, right? It's like all these little balls all over your body, and it kind of it puts all that information back into the system to show the picture of what's going on.
Right.
You're always trying to understand where you are in space. You're always trying to understand like where the danger is coming from, right?
Right. Well, I think the big thing with that is, as an athlete, as a coach, you can't assume. You really can't assume very much. You can't assume much about a movement pattern. You can't assume that an athlete is going to feel something where they should be. It can look like they will, or they should, but proprioception can be very, very important. Again, I talk to a lot of people who don't work like textbooks. So someone might look like they should be getting a glute working, doesn't mean it is. And that proprioception can be hugely important in continuing to drive the rest of the training. And if you extrapolate that over time, that's going to culminate in, again, hypertrophy. So hypertrophy tells us use more than anything.
So what would be the environment that hypertrophy needs to have to happen? Like, what are the key factors of that people need to kind of focus in on when they're training? I
think if we were going to take a movement and ask the question of like, what makes a movement a good hypertrophy movement, there are pillars, right? And Joe Bennett's talked about this a lot, but I'll talk about joint alignment. He'll talk about making sure that the actual loading profile in the movement is appropriate for where you're trying to overload the muscle within the range, right? He'll talk about stability and bracing, meaning how stable you are is going to obviously allow you to produce more force. But the element that I would add on are anthropometrics, because your individual makeup, someone who's got super long femurs, isn't going to be able to benefit from something, or not benefit well anyway, from something like a back squat, or someone who's got short femurs, where they're going to have different range of motion. So you even look at guys like, Mike Israetel, and he can press super, super deep on the leg press. But I take his leg press and I put it up next to my husband's, totally different anthropometrics. If my husband tries to go to that deep in his press, he's borrowing motion from somewhere, or he's cranking on his hip joint. So I think when it comes down to creating an environment for hypertrophy, those pillars have to be absolutely maximized. And the thing is, you can't make yours look just like someone else's. And in fact, that was probably how my big adductor injury happened, was I was trying to squat like someone else, which is dumb, but I think you'd know better.
I think people don't realize how involved and complicated movements really are.
Yeah.
And so I always try to explain it as, I don't describe a movement as describing the mechanical motion, because it's too hard to get that correct. So like we were saying yesterday, like working the lateral delts, the medial head of the deltoid, there's no one correct form for a lateral raise. If you're trying to create tension on that muscle, the correct form is whatever puts tension on that muscle. And so that's really what you need to be focused on. This is different than if you're training for a movement. Like the best movement for a squat is what keeps you within the rules of what a squat is in a in powerlifting. If you're training squats for quads, it's different. But if you want to know like how complicated it is and why it's so difficult to explain as far as biomechanical movement patterns, you remember like in physics class when you try to find the torque on like a bar of length L? That's one bar of length L with one torque, and people got that wrong. All that. Well, now how many muscles are in the legs? And so when you're doing a squat, how many bars are there of different lengths and thicknesses, and they're all different for each person. So you got all the muscles of the quads, the adductors, the sartorius, the hips, the hip flexors, your glutes, your lower back, and all of those have different lengths for each person, and probably even each leg on you. you know? And so to try to, like to call just one movement that's correct for all those and is going to be correct for all people is impossible.
Well, I think even beyond that too, if you take that a step further and think about all those muscles, if we actually stop and fully appreciate the fact that none of these muscles run in just a straight, point A to point B line. They're three-dimensional. And if we don't stop and actually appreciate that, in addition to something like some of the joint kinematics. So, as you go through a squat, the head of your femur, the hip has to rotate within the socket, which is going to change some of the relative rotational demand. And so you really can't isolate all these variables like you were saying. And I think, the more people are exposed to different thought processes on social media, the more confounded and muddy the waters become. And I really, really hope that at the end of the day, people can start to take a little bit of ownership of learning what works for them and recognize that it's probably not going to be what's popular on social media. And that's fine.
You have to make sure you're asking the right question too,
ask one more question. Yeah. Once you ask the right one, ask another.
Because people say, the best form on squat. Well, what are you doing the squat for? Are you a rugby player? Are you a power lifter? Are you lifting in triple ply gear? Are you raw? Are you wearing knee reps? Are you doing squats to train your quads? Because all of those are different. If I'm trying to build really big quads, my squat is different than if I'm wearing a triple ply suit in a powerlifting meet, which is different than if I'm doing a raw squat with knee reps. That's different than if I'm doing a raw squat without knee reps. So they're all different. They're different questions because they're looking for a different answer. And people don't do that. They just say, what's the best squat form?
Right.